Most people have heard about the terrible slave trade in the Atlantic. But when schools try to hide the troubling facts and events of the Atlantic slave trade, the scary facts and events will never be known. Some books that have been banned try to tell about the tortures, crimes, and other cruel things that happened in the trade. Even so, they hide things that are scary, upsetting, and sad for many countries, like the US, UK, and the Netherlands. But where are we going with this? From putting tens of millions of black people to work as slaves, beating and torturing them, cutting off their ears and other body parts, giving them little more than the size of a grave and ships for the trip, and making them work. Events like that are kept hidden. Even black slaves were sometimes thrown into the seas to make the ships lighter, but their ears were cut off so that slave owners in Europe and America could see that they had bought slaves who had to be thrown. How many more secrets are there? The Atlantic slave trade. From the early 1600s to the late 1800s, millions of African slaves were taken against their will and shipped to the Americas and Europe. This was called the Atlantic slave trade. Thousands of black Africans were taken away on hundreds of ships that came from Europe and the Americas to Africa. Then, they were chained in small places on the ship's lower decks so that as many slaves as possible could fit. Conditions on ships weren't that different from those in graves, where thousands of black Africans were chained down so they couldn't move. So, between 15 and 25% of black Africans died during the Atlantic slave trade, which moved more than 12 million black Africans. In other words, 2.75 million black people died on long, dangerous trips. African slaves. At the beginning of the 1500s, Portugal and Spain started to take over the New World and set up colonies. They forced the native people to work on their farms, but African slaves died because of how violently they were taken over, and because Europeans brought diseases with them. There wasn't enough work in Europe because of all the Indian slaves. Because of this lack, people in Europe looked to Africa for an answer. As more and more Portuguese and Spanish colonists went to Africa, the continent became a major source of slaves for Europe, the Spanish West Indies, and Portuguese colonies in Brazil. So, Indian slaves were slowly replaced by African slaves. But there is something you should know. Before the Europeans came and took them away, black Africans were not slaves. They were the same kind of people as Europeans and Americans. But the white people made it clear that Africans were slaves. Hence, people in Europe and the United States thought that Africans were also slaves in Africa. But that wasn't how things turned out. Before Africans were forced to work as slaves, they were farmers, merchants, troops, musicians, goldsmiths, blacksmiths, and more. They were more than just things because they had families and societies. But when Europeans took over their villages, they were taken as slaves. They were put on big ships, taken to Europe, and then sent to different places in the Americas. In different parts of Europe, they were forced to live in horrible conditions and do hard work. They were also beaten and whipped. They were forced to work long hours in harsh conditions and bad weather. They went through unimaginable pain. The ships. People think that the first slave ship from Africa to the Americas set sail in 1526. Even before this time, Europeans bought Africans as slaves, and European colonists also forced Native Americans to work as slaves. Before 1518, it was against the rules of the Spanish government to bring slaves from Africa to Spain. They did this not out of a sense of morality or humanity, but because they thought Africans were savage and would ruin European society with their pagan and non-Christian ways. But on August 18, 1518, King Charles V gave a charter to move 4,000 slaves straight from Africa to the Spanish-American colonies. This was done to help the economy. The rule was changed, and King Charles gave permission for slaves to be brought from Africa to Spanish colonies in America, as long as they were converted to Christianity while crossing the Atlantic Ocean. During the triangular trade, goods from Europe went to Africa, slaves from Africa went to the Americas, and raw materials from American plantations went back to Europe. People from all three countries were involved in the transatlantic slave trade. Still, the Middle Passage voyage was the most important part of the story. The trade path that slaves were taken on is called the Middle Passage, and the trip was often hard and even dangerous. The trip could take anywhere from 3 to 6 months, depending on the weather, and about 20% of the sailors on slave ships died during the trip. During the transatlantic slave trade, ships were used to move African slaves. These ships were all different sizes and could hold different numbers of people. Slaves were kept locked up below deck in small, dark spaces with little access to sunshine. They had to do forced exercises, like dancing, to make sure they stayed fit. Inside the deck, the air was hot and stale and smelled like dirt and human waste. The slaves went hungry and thirsty. They were chained together tightly below decks, where they were at risk of getting sick and being attacked by pirates. Many people were also hurt physically, sexually, and emotionally by slave dealers and crewmen. Africans captured. Historians think that between 15 and 25% of the Africans who were taken as slaves died on the long trip. Only a small number of the Africans who were taken as part of the slave trade ended up in North America. Most of them went to the Caribbean and South America. Almost half of the about 5 million slaves taken from Africa and elsewhere were sent to Brazil. At first, most of the Africans the Portuguese took as slaves were taken during clan wars. But as the demand grew, they started to force their way into the middle of Africa to capture people. From the 1600s to the 1850s, more than 8 out of 10 Africans were forced into the slave trade. By 1820, nearly 4 Africans had been shipped across the Atlantic for every 1 European, and 4 out of every 5 women who crossed the Atlantic were from Africa. Cannibals. Before European and American slave traders came along and forced Africans to work as slaves, African kings sold prisoners as slaves. But as time went on, Europeans and Americans wanted more African slaves, so they started using guns to force Africans to work for them. Africans who were taken prisoner by Europeans often thought that the Europeans were cannibals who planned to cook and eat them. They didn't know that their masters saw them as a product and a way to make money. People in Europe and the United States would sometimes pay slave traders ahead of time, and then ships would go to Africa and take people. But since a lot of them died, the buyers would not be sure that they were not taken as slaves in the first place. But the truth was that some of those slaves died from cramps, and others were thrown alive into the oceans because the ships were too heavy. Slave dealers would kill a lot of slaves to protect their many wine drums. So, it was decided that when slaves died or were thrown into the ocean in the future, slave traders would cut off their ears to show their customers as proof. You can guess how Africans were treated like tools instead of people. The terrible things that happened during the Atlantic slave trade are known, and people feel ashamed. Different countries that gained from the slave trade and grew their economies because of it have said they are sorry. In 1998, UNESCO set aside August 23rd as the International Day for the Remembrance of the Slave Trade and its abolition. This led to other events that showed how slavery hurt Africa. In the end, at the 2001 World Conference Against Racism in Durban, South Africa, African nations asked former slave trading nations to say sorry for slavery. Some countries were ready to say sorry, but others, like the United Kingdom, Portugal, Spain, the Netherlands, and the United States, were against it. This shows that they still don't regret it. Did your school ever teach you about how terrible the Atlantic slave trade was? In the textbooks, weren't the facts changed and told in a less harsh way? Do let us know in the comments below. That's all for today. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a like and hit that subscribe button before you go. Thanks for watching.